Good morning. Let's go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone. Part 3. I told Pete no more promises on finishing the chapter, but we will leave at 8. So I am going to try to finish this. I was up early this morning and still tweaking the slides and just trying to get some clarity and shortening things too. So I think in a chapter like this, we just have to be okay with there's going to be a lot left kind of undone, right? And that's okay. That's all right. All right. So let's just jump to the. Let's jump right to the. Discussion. I'll take attendance. We'll say a prayer, and we're going to jump into. And this is not working. Let's just do it old-fashioned way. Okay. We're going to address this morning, but as you read this, or just from your own experience, and I'm going to leave the question stands as is. I didn't add the word biblical. I'm just going to leave it as is. What form of church government do you believe to be the most effective will be our discussion topic. Go ahead, if you don't know the guys at your table, as they're accustomed, introduce yourself. Then we'll discuss. Thoughts on this? Do you believe to be the most effective? I was kind of listening to conversations, and I heard it's important to have elders, and there's some freedom in this, isn't there? Because we see different. We're going to talk about this different forms of church government that we see today. And if you read the chapter, Gruden makes a statement that still it's possible to be more pure in this discussion as well, right? Meaning that some may be better than others, but there is some freedom in the scriptures as to because it's not that specific. And talks about some of the offices of the church. But your thoughts, what form of church government do you believe to be the most effective? Some of the comments.
You know, in the Methodist Church, they change pastors every 2 or 3 years regardless. And I always thought, that is really strange. You know, why would you do that? I still can't figure it out.
It makes it very difficult.
Yeah.
And the local congregation does not have say into that either, right? I don't know what the governing body is, but they rotate people through the different.
Right.
And
they can request certain things, but they don't have a lot of say.
Okay.
And a good pastor, why would you just let him go after 2 or 3 years, just automatically?
Yeah. I would assume it has something to do with the term limit concept, right? And there's pros and cons to this, right? Yeah, absolutely. Other comments? Thank you, Gary. I wonder if it's something the average person thinks a lot about. Probably not. We in a membership class, we talk about our form of church government, and people have questions about, because it is different. If you look at the way we've set up with the multi-site model, and people will ask, and then every church labels some terms. We have guiding elders and shepherding elders. Well, I don't know if that's specifically my elders, but what does that mean? What's the difference? People, and these are great questions at our church, but maybe people don't think about it.
I was just saying, along with Gary, you know, other denominations do that too. They rotate those people, and it just occurred to me that these denominational people, when you have the hierarchy, the structure, usually you have the point person, whoever it be, the priest or whoever's at that particular parish or that church, and then the people that are above him or whatever, they're not even involved in that congregation. They're not there. You know, they're somewhere else, you know, off site. So you only have the one person, whereas, you know, a more congregational method or anything like that with elders, they're involved in the body themselves, so they're there.
Right.
It's a different type of, so I think there is some, I don't know, just, there's not an intimacy that they have that, you know, people can go to.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting. If you look at our church, you could argue we've set up a mini Presbyterian system as well, just from the having multiple locations with a centralized board that does make the final decisions in the guiding elder board. Because if we're going to do this, you have to have that, right? You have to have some decision-making body because you have multiple campuses. But you could see, even in some ways, a mini representation in some aspects to that. as well. So let's continue this. Here we are with our schedule. You'll notice we did part 1, 2, and I should say 3, typo when I cut and pasted today. It's funny. I have really appreciated the discussion we've had up to this point. I just think it's been good. It's funny because chapter 16 was God's providence. We spent 3 weeks on God's providence and church government. It's just funny. It's a topic of high interest and really some weighty topics. We've talked about divorce as a qualification for an elder. Is that what a one-woman man means? And so there's been some great practical discussion, and it'll continue today as well. But we will. I'm going to try my best so we can move on to chapter 48 for next week, means of grace within the church. So let's jump into this. Let me fast forward to slide 17, and let's talk about different forms of church government. And so what Gruden does is set up 3 categories. If you read the chapter, an Episcopalian, which is the hierarchical, the Catholic Church, where there's a top-down model, and then a Presbyterian, which is somewhat mixed, perhaps the Methodist, the Presbyterian, where there's local elders and pastors at the congregation, but some of those elders belong to a greater council that makes some of the weightier decisions. And then in the congregational method, there's all kinds of different breakdowns. We would find ourselves in the third one. We would find ourselves in the congregational category, where Gruden has placed us, with some elements of our multi-site model, maybe leaning towards a mini Presbyterian model as well. And if you've been around or studied churches, there are many variations of church government where we see in the scriptures, we talked about the office of elder, we've talked about an office of deacon, we talked about the term apostle, and that we hold to that office no longer applies today. But other than that, there were elders appointed in the churches, and there's aspects of what qualifications, and you can glean from what those are. These are the responsibilities of elder. Other than that, that's why we have so many variations. The Catholic Church would tell us when you get away from the structure that chaos reigns, they would look at I don't know how many hundreds of variations and say, this is because you've gotten away from a structure, then now it's just everybody's doing, there's no more accountability, and it's just too many variations. It's chaotic, all the denominations and all of this. There's no centralized foundation anymore. That would be, the Catholic Church would look at the Protestant Church and say that. So let's talk about this first, the Episcopal. I just took these right from the book, cut and pasted the charts, if you had a chance to read this. So this, as you can see, there is a structure there. You've got your archbishop at the top, then bishops, rectors, and these different churches may have different languages for these or different terms. They may identify them differently. This is, I don't know what page this is in the book, guys. 47.1 is the chart number. But you can see that there's a definite centralized top, and then it just kind of flows down through the structure, through the organization. So I don't know if anyone's if you come from a Catholic Church background, you belong to a structure like this, very structured, very organized. And Episcopalian Church, Anglican Church, you see the same thing. Is anyone? Some of you have a history in this, correct? Maybe you just went to your local parish or local church and didn't think much of what's happening probably above it, correct? So any thoughts on this highly structured top-down model of a church government? And as we go through these, let me go back this up for just a minute. There's going to be pros and cons to all of this, right? There will be. The Methodist Church, why? I love my pastor. Why are they leaving? I'm just getting to know them. They just baptized my children, or were they married? Why are they leaving us? And so there's pros and cons and negatives and positives. There's challenges, and there's for all of these, correct? And they're all different. But any thoughts on this as a structure? I'm sorry, I'm asking questions and not giving time, but if you read the book too, the Gruden goes into more detail. I'm not going to mention a lot of that. He gives some scripture connections to each of these forms. We're not going to get that detailed just because of time's sake. Thoughts on this?
It just seems as though everything in a whole and the different forms of government, how God uses each of them for His glory. And, I was just kind of thinking of how everything is set up between Episcopalian to congregational. It seems, because we are in a spiritual war. And so, so the Lord has his churches set up in a way that fights the battle effectively. And yeah, it's like, yeah, we already know that he won the battle. And but having different, just looking at the congregational seems more of a militia type, but they're so interwoven in the community that that puts them at a real good position, and then you have the Episcopalian, and it's like, okay, yeah, hey, we're a little bit more structured here, we're more aiming on the offensive towards this, and just looking at it as a spiritual warfare and how God has his churches set up. So to bring his name honor, praise and glory, and it's just really cool.
Yeah, thank you.
How are the, like archbishops, are they chosen by the bishops? How do they arise to the top? Because it looks like the top position is over all and would direct.
Right,
the
that's a
bishops,
good
and
question.
the electors are like the priest in the local church. That's what that is.
Yes, and then some, there's a word, they'll use the word vicar, I don't know if I pronounced that right, so these terms that were correct, and you're gonna see different terms assigned. If you're in the Catholic Church, there's one more level of this, what would it be? Overall, all of this would be, the Pope would be on top of this, and remember, when the Pope speaks ex cathedra, out of his chair is what that literally means, meaning when he's speaking God's truth to the church, to us, and there's a great authority with that the Catholic Church would say goes all the way back to Peter 2,000 years ago. And you can see within that structure, the church structure itself is highly important to the Catholic Church. We have a much different view of that here at Village Bible Church, and Protestant Church generally has a much different view of that. To answer your question, Al, I don't know. I think if you look at the next Pope is chosen, which is really a fascinating procedure from the Catholic Church based on centuries of church tradition, where it's chosen by the congregation of archbishops who gather and they lock themselves. There's full of ceremony, and and then the smoke, when they finally reach consensus, I don't know which color comes out the chimney to let everyone in the St. Peter's Basilica know that we found a new pope. And so there's a whole elaborate process there to choose a new pope as well. I don't know, and perhaps that's different in each tradition.
Wasn't it, I was teaching, I remember at the time, and I think it was from 20 to 2010, where in the Episcopalian, I think he was an archbishop, came out that he was like homosexual, or he was, and that created a stir in the Episcopalian church, and so I think it probably was an archbishop.
Yeah.
I think it was, and there was a big controversy because the conservative Episcopalians in the United States, they didn't want to be under control of the more liberal archbishops. They wanted to be under the control of the African Episcopalians, because they were still holding the conservative. There's problems.
Yes, yep, right. Sure, and you know what? Let me pause for a minute. I neglected to ask the Lord's blessing on our time this morning. Let's do that. Lord, we thank you again this morning for the privilege of gathering together because we want to know more of who you are. God, as we discuss again some weighty topics and even challenging verses from the New Testament that are difficult for us to understand, and a difficult, Lord, to understand even in light of our current culture. So I pray, God, that you would give us humility in our study. Lord, challenge us to always go back to your word for our truth as we've been commanded to do. And thank you, God, for the men who are in this room. Thank you for the blessing it is to be able to learn and grow in knowledge of you together. We ask your blessing on our very short time together this morning. In your son's name, amen. Okay. All right, so that's the highly structured form of government. I think it's worth pointing out before we move on, when in the book, he doesn't frame these in this is wrong, absolutely wrong and unbiblical. Well, some of the ones in the end, yes, especially when we get to that spirit-led form of government. But really what he's talking about here is to say that this is not inherently wrong. He frames it in, there's some that are more effective or less effective, more pure, less pure. So there's perhaps a continuum there, but I think we had to be careful in saying, well, this highly structured view like we see here, is anti-biblical, it's sinful, or it's wrong. And be careful of that. And because there's just seems to be a lot of leeway in the Scripture with when it comes to church government. I think it's important to remember that. Let's go to the Presbyterian model. So we see these complex, some of these charts here. It's funny because even here we do have. I should have put a slide. We have an organizational chart for Village Bible Church that we reapprove every year, just because when it comes to structure, these things matter, and they matter when there's conflict. When there's an issue, nobody wants to talk about policy, but all of a sudden policy, it really becomes important. The Constitution carries a lot of weight when there is, to help alleviate conflict, because having agreed upon set of standards and things will follow as a church, that we agree to do this voluntarily. We vote this in, saying this is the rules by which we will govern ourselves, and all agree to. Because within those possibilities, we want to make sure we don't have chaos and we have as much unity as we can. So we have an organizational chart for Village Bible Church too. So this is a little bit different. You have your congregation at the bottom. You've got your elders above that. But then some of the elders will belong to a greater group, a general assembly above, that makes some of the weightier decisions, such as Gary brought up earlier too. These decisions will be made, so there is some connection still with local selection of elders, but some are called to go serve at a higher level too and make more important decisions for the church. So I would say we take this Episcopalian or Anglican or Catholic version, and this is more of a kind of a hybrid, a little more of a mix between the congregational models and then the really highly structured. And some of you come from a Presbyterian background. Any thoughts on that form of church government? Does anyone come from a Presbyterian background? Well, I was mistaken.
I come from a Baptist background, but my parents have found themselves in a Presbyterian church now, near the end of their life. And it's very, very interesting, their perspective on Presbyterianism coming from a Baptist background.
In what way?
And, well, so the Presbyterian denomination that they're in is one of the more liberal ones, but their pastor is more conservative. And so they're like, well, we're okay with this Presbyterian church because we know that our pastor is more aligned with what they believe the Bible says. But then every once in a while he'll go on vacation and they'll bring, somebody else in who says things that they're a little bit like, wow, we don't know if we quite agree with that or not. So it's just kind of interesting. And I think that from what they see, in the Baptist church, people are a lot more involved. They know what's going on. They take a lot more ownership. Whereas in the Presbyterian, because of the form of government, a lot of the people are a little bit more observers. Decisions kind of happen and then they just go along with it.
Right.
So it is, a little bit more of a passive involvement from the churchgoers' perspective.
Right, and thanks, Sam. And if you look at the top, the decisions made at the General Assembly, when those elders that are designated to do so go up and make those decisions as a local body, those are implemented down through the entire organization. And so what you lose in a system like this is that, you could say, local control over some doctrinal points and practices, because they're looking at the whole Presbyterian organization as one unit with a leadership that makes the decisions. And this is where you're going to get varied messages or teaching depending on the pastor that's coming in. But generally, and some people will not fully implement that. I'm sure that's happening somewhere in there too. But generally, that would be expected at all. And you can see, even if you look at, I'm just going to use our example. Let's just say we've got 6 campuses, but at the top, you've got a guiding elder board that we are by the Constitution tasked with setting doctrinal practices and settling doctrinal issues in the church. And so if it's settled at the guiding elder level, then at all 6 campuses, it would be expected that would be the teaching positions and our direction moving forward. It sounds like kind of mini model of this, doesn't it? And so you could I'd probably say a successful argument to say we're seeing some of that same. Now I would hope that the pastors we bring in we would be very, very concerned if there was different messages being taught. Very concerned, because that's one of the requirements. You would have to agree with the teaching positions. But if you're a member of this church, you signed a document that said, I will abide by it. And we didn't say full agreement, but I will abide by the teaching. We understand that full agreement may not be the best, but I can abide by the teaching positions if I'm ever in that place of authority to teach, I will abide by the teaching positions of the church for unity's sake, because otherwise then chaos happens when you're right. One pastor says this, another one comes in and says this. What's the congregation to do? Any other questions or comments about the Presbyterian form of government?
I was in a very conservative, small Presbyterian denomination called the Orthodox Presbyterian Church for a number of years. Is anybody familiar with Robert's Rule of Order? Now, they use that very strictly at Presbyterian. And that is a strange system. Does anybody, do we use that in our church meetings, Robert's Rule of Order?
We use them at the board level to make decisions. We don't use them, for example, there's a family forum coming and we have an annual meeting. We do not use Robert's Rule of Order because there's no business being conducted at those meetings. Church business. It's more presentations and here's what in reports. So what form were you seeing Robert's Rules of Order?
At a Presbyterian level. I went to one of them, and it's very strict.
At the leadership, at these decision, okay.
Yeah.
Yes.
It's almost, you almost feel like you're being shut down, that people can't, because if something has been, whatever, I don't know, I don't know Robert's Rule of Order, but I thought, man, that's a tough system.
And how many leaders were in the room making the decisions? What side of a group was it?
It was a pretty big group.
Which is why they're using Robert's Rules of Order, because
Robert's Rule of Order is number one as far as the guideline for conducting meetings.
Yeah.
Or the
I just, if you've never seen it in action, it's quite
used many
interesting.
places.
it's very, very highly structured and unforgiving. And it's done that way so that there is, to keep, again, it's order in a meeting, so there's not chaos at the decision-making level. We use Robert's Rules of Order, I don't know what's the word, light? More. Correct. We use it more, especially we do speak in terms of making motions and moving, so carried, just so that there is an official record of, so we keep a record of discussion and public minutes. And so it does function somewhat like a board, and most boards will rely on Robert's Rules of Order. So Chris and then Steve had a comment.
So, yeah, I'm just pretty ignorant on the term, Robert's Rule of Order.
Yeah.
So it would be like, I make a motion to add this to the annual budget.
Gotcha.
And somebody's got to second that, and then there might be discussion over it, and then somebody's got to come to a decision.
And the leader's got the
Almost
gavel.
kind of like a gavel. Okay.
I do not use a gavel at the meetings.
There's a ton of detail though, and I don't know, it seemed like to me, if a discussion had been closed, it's like, it's closed. You can't bring up anything else on that subject.
Okay.
And so it felt like it was stymieing, just conversation. But then again, they want order.
Because correct, and that's what, if you can look it up online, there's a whole entire manual. It is very strict if you're going to follow this to its full extent on how to write. It is very, very formal, extremely formal.
Congress uses it, right?
Correct, yes.
So it's more like a time frame. Hey, we only have 5 minutes to talk.
It's
In
a
order to
thick
get
book.
through
That's
this
what it
meeting,
is.
we gotta keep slow.
It's more than just, yes,
Okay.
because chaos makes for long meetings. So yes, there is a timing to it, but it's more to structure the meetings so that there's order instead of chaos. And so churches will adopt.
And I think it's documented as well, so that it's well established who brought this new thing to the agenda. What did we talk about, and when did we come to a decision on it, and what exactly is that decision? So it's a way that when something gets challenged, say 2 years from now, we can look back and say, okay, this is why we brought it up. We talked about these things that may be an issue, and we still decided.
Okay.
And we use our records all the time to go back 6 and say, where did this come from again? When did we make that decision? So we can go back and say, oh, yeah, there it is. And there's a record of what was discussed. And oh, yeah, now I remember that. It's helped us. We do that constantly just so we have that record. And it's served us well as a board, too. Steve, you had a comment.
I wasn't familiar with the term either.
Yeah, you can look it up. It is, if you've been on any formal or state board, you're very familiar with Robert's Rules of Orders because and there's different forms of it, but generally you can go ahead and look that up, and it's you see that.
It brings order, but it also can be used to control
Yeah.
as well too. They'll shut you down if you're not going to their narrative. They'll take control.
Yes. And I think let's just stick with churches since that we're talking about, is it's possible for anyone to misuse that authority. And once again, we talked about the danger of an elder who misuses their authority, and that is just catastrophic to the church. And anytime, I don't care if it's through Robert's Rules of Order or just whatever method they want to do, when it becomes about power and authoritarian rule, the church is in trouble. Absolutely. Okay, let's continue. Congregational. Here's what Gruden wrote. There was 5. He wrote there's that single elder pastor model. We have the plural elders, the corporate board, then the last 2 I just lumped together, pure democracy and let the Spirit lead. Has anyone ever been part of a church where they just led by a pure democracy? Which anyone would tell you a pure democracy equals chaos, right? Because we live in a republic. We talk about the democratic process. The United States is not a pure democracy. It's a republic. It's not. We don't get to vote on everything that we want and get to do. We represent leaders to do that for us so that we're not ineffective. All right, so has anyone ever been part of that pure democratic church or involved in that? Because I have not. I was even trying to think, is there any that label themselves that way, and I didn't even find it, just a quick search on the internet. Any thoughts or comments on that? Anyone have a history? Technically, the congregational church is about the congregation led. I'm getting ahead of myself. We'll talk about it. Okay, let's move forward. Let's talk about each one of these briefly in the chart from the book. Okay, and again, there's pros and cons to each one of these, correct? And we're going to have a lot more experience with these because we've been a part of churches probably that more or less resembled these categories. So here's the first one, single elder or / pastor. So here in this model, you've got a pastor who is the elder of the church. We talked last week about small churches. If you've got 30 people in your church, probably this is what you have. The pastor is the elder, so it's, again, meeting the biblical qualification for elder. Again, we mostly see, in fact, we always see plural elders, but you may not have more than one qualified besides the pastor, so you're stuck with the one. And then you have usually a deacon board that serves under that, and then the congregation will affirm, then usually the deacon board will affirm and hire the pastor. And this is common, this fact, up until 2003, this was the form of government. That's not necessarily true. We had more than one elder, but we saw this here at even Village Bible Church. You had a pastor probably that was on top with an elder board and a deacon board underneath that had veto power over each other, and then the congregation. So there's pros and cons to this, correct? What would be, listen to me like this, what would be a challenge with this form of church leadership? What would be a challenge? There's going to be a challenge to every single one of them. There's no one that's perfect. What's the challenge to this?
Pastor could get bogged down with a lot of administrative issues, not being able to just pastor.
Okay. Good. Pastor is, you're a one-person show, meaning that you're leading, it's everything, right? So you're probably wearing a whole lot of hats. Mm-hmm. What else?
I feel like if the pastor falls, then the whole church crumbles.
Or if the pastor decides to abuse their authority or for whatever reason falls in it for any way, it's easier because you're just by yourself, correct? There isn't anyone else. You're kind of the corporate model, whether it's a congregation of 30 or a congregation of 3,000. If you're at the top if you're alone, that CEO model, I think there's some danger for the church for that, because then all of a sudden, sometimes you see the personality driven. I mean, I want to be careful because certainly not every system that's what's happening, but that's the danger. If you're by yourself at the top, there's some danger and there's no checks and balance for that. And we talked last week, we have seen that danger in this model in the life of our own church 20 years ago, when there was some really dark times, and Pete was there for that, Al was there for that, remembers those times very, very well. It was ugly, horribly ugly. Sam?
Sometimes you get in the risk of the pastor is seen as hyper spiritual, super spiritual, and so it's, if anybody ever disagrees with the pastor, even on just something basic, it's kind of like, well, the pastor knows, and so sometimes you get away from seeking the word, and well, let's go ask the pastor about this.
Yeah, right. Yes, yep. That's another one of the dangers there too, correct. And again, sometimes by necessity, a church will have this. Again, if you've got one pastor and no other elders, or no one's qualified, or no one's, then this is what you'll have. And again, not every system is corrupt or every pastor in this, but there is that temptation that you have to be wary of for sure. Go ahead.
Have you ever seen if you put on the top, elder board on the top, then pastoral staff on the second tier in congregation, where it's elder-led and pastor-driven or board? Have you ever seen
The elder board is kind of over the pastor.
Yes.
Yeah, that was more of a corporate, we'll get to that, more of a corporate board model. We'll get to that. I think that's similar to what you're saying. Again, there's so many variations of this. There really are, and we label things differently. I think Gruden did a good job of trying to put them in categories. This is still the single elder pastor, but this is where instead of, you see the difference in the charts, it's subtle, but it's not, meaning that it's much different to run a church. Again, think of a small church where the deacon and pastor board's together, where the pastor is not above that, but there is a deacon board and an elder board and an elder board and an elder and the pastor working together to lead the church. The pastor and the deacons, they may govern it together. So it's a variation of this one, just moving the deacon board on up to the same level and putting the pastor in the midst. So this becomes in somewhat of a corporate board model. And in this, what would be a challenge for this form of government? Whoops, this one. Some would say that the deacons should not be elders. I mean, there's a difference in that office. That deacons seem to be, they were leaders in the church. We talked about that last week, but that the elders and deacons were on different levels of leadership, and so not everybody would say that. In our history of our church, deacons and elders, I was there when, if you had a decision had to be made, it had to be approved by the elder board and the deacon board silently. So if the deacon board said no, the elder board would not be able to proceed with their decision. And so there was an equality there, and some churches function that way too. Any thoughts about this single elder pastor model?
So are you saying that scripturally you're indifferent about deacons and elders being on the same level? 'Cause I thought we were saying that deacons are really not on the same level.
No, that's right. Sorry, if I was unclear, that's what I meant, is that they shouldn't be on the same, that's just one of the challenges of this. Some would look at that and say the elders and deacons should not be on the same level. They should be separate, correct. Yep. Deacons are leaders in the church, but they're not on the same authority or responsibilities that elders have in the New Testament. They should be separate, is one of the people would look at this and say they shouldn't be together. That's not, elder and deacons should not be at the same level of leadership in the church. Thanks for, if I wasn't clear on that, I want to clarify. Okay, so let's continue. Plural elders. This probably is, when I first came here in 2005 to Village, this is what I encountered, is that we had a plurality of elders leading the church. Like I said this before, Tim used to introduce himself as, hi, I'm one of the elders here responsible for preaching. And that, because remember, the word pastor, as we've defined it in our culture, is, and you look at the New Testament, pastor and elder are synonymous. Whether you're doing it full-time or as a lay person, where you're a volunteer, not doing it for your career or pay, the qualifications are exactly the same. And so this is where you have the different elders. You have one in charge of priests. Some may be paid, some may not. One preaches, one's in charge of this. And so you have a plurality of elders, and then you're running, then you're leading the church. Let's see. You would say for example, in this you might have a pastor who would call themselves the first among all equals, because somebody still has got to be leading something, right? Hey, calling a board meeting, or let's meet together, setting things, giving some guidance to the agenda. Here's what we need to talk about. So, but you look at that as all are equal to each other. Our church now, we changed when we went to a multi-site model, but still, this was very important to us when we wrote the Constitution in 2010 to keep this plurality of elders. It seems to be consistent with the New Testament. Left elders, always plural, though not mandated, but that seems to be the model that elders were left to lead the church. Okay, so any thoughts on this one? We did have people would come and say, but who's the pastor? Where's the pastor? My mother-in-law struggled with that greatly because it was just new. Even when I came, it was somewhat new to have Tim introduce himself. He's the guy preaching, but he was again, we had just come off of this horrific experience 3 or 4 years earlier, so he wanted to be the board wanted to be very clear that we are led by a plurality of elders who are equal with each other at the board. There was not one.
When we switched to that, when we had a meeting where the elders were up on the stage and introducing a new style of government, and there were quite a few people. One says, okay, if I have a problem, something with my daughter or something, who do I go to? I have no idea. I always used to be able to go to my pastor, and I could get help.
Right.
Now I don't know who to go to.
Right. And that's because people don't see the lay elders and the pastors as synonymous, right? Because we don't. It's just, you see, well, that's the pastor. This is the elder, and there's kind of a difference there. But this is why those qualifications are so key in 1 Timothy 3 and Titus 1, that they are maintained, because there is no difference biblically between the pastor that's paid and the elder who's leading. The qualifications should be the same.
And I remember that meeting too, Al. And I think shortly after that is when the up front identified that we're now going to a flock model, where, Chad, you have this part of the congregation and you would reach out to them, because that question needed to be answered. If you do have a personal problem, you need to go somebody, and there is nobody that's identified as like the pastor, and you come from that. That was as I recall, that was a really comforting time when you guys came back out and said, okay, this is what we're going to do. We're going to divide the congregation. And then as part of it, I think we're going to add elders as the congregation grows. So we never go beyond whatever the model is, the size of group that you can actually support. Which is, back to the previous model, that was the problem my dad had, is that because he was the pastor and then there were deacons and there was a delineation, the deacons didn't go visit anybody. Their job was to care for the church. His job was to be with them. Well, if there were 5 or 6 sick people in the congregation, or an elder of the congregation, he was constantly working all day and then going and visiting people at night and then visiting people. And so that's where I like this model better, because any of you can go visit somebody and then you have a group that's assigned to you. And I think that was a comforting factor for the congregation coming out of that period where that question was viable. And there were a lot of people, I think, that identified with that.
Yeah, thanks, Pete. And the problem is, some people will say, but that's great, but Chad's not a pastor. And so it took some time to reframe some thinking that pastor and elder are synonymous in the New Testament. There's no difference. Comment coming from over here.
I was just going to say I really enjoy this as well, because there are, as you look at it, it's like, wow, okay, well, who do I go to? Well, you can go to any of them. And, if one elder specializes in one specific area or has more knowledge on this, then that elder will say, you know what, let me talk to so-and-so, or, hey, well, did you bring this up to so-and-so, because they have a lot more experience in this than I do, and so forth. And, being in the workforce, you had, the 5 different managers, and you always found the one manager that you connected most with, and felt comfortable with. And I think just being human, and that's just who we are. We're just going to go to somebody who we feel more comfortable with, and then either they will handle the situation or it's kind of going back to being giving everything to the pastor. It's like, wow, that's a lot of burdens for one person to handle, where this is kind of more spread out, and you're not overburdening one person, but you're using their specialties as God has given them their skills.
Yeah. And it took some while to reframe some thinking with some of the elders too, to say, you need to see yourself as a pastor of the church. Those qualifications apply to you. And there's a weight to this, and you need to be able to see yourself in that role. If you are an elder, whether you're up on the stage every Sunday preaching or not, does not matter. You are a pastor. I'm going to use that word because that's our culturally significant of Village Bible Church, and you must see yourself that way, whether you're paid to do it or not. And so it was a reframing of thinking, Al.
I think it's still just human nature. I agree, and I think the small groups really help emphasize that the responsibility of the elders and that you can go to them. But I would just bet you a lot of people, even in our church, would say, well, if I have a question, I'd want to go to Tim.
Yeah.
Because he's up there all the time. He's the one I would really, I'll maybe bypass the others and I'll see him.
Yeah.
Because-
Right, because he's the public face of the church too, correct, yes, right. And that is natural human thinking, and that's fine. And I don't think you're gonna stop that, because Tim's the one that's making the connections. The person who's doing the teaching and publicly is gonna make connections with people.
I think it's worth noting too that our secular culture calls this a patriarchal tyranny. Okay? And I think this is the best biblical government, but our secular culture says this is a patriarchal tyranny.
Yeah, and this is not popular in modern culture, for sure. My personal opinion is, this is my go-to form of church government as well in the New Testament. I would agree with that statement. I see this as the closest to the biblical model, but again, I'm not saying the other ones are wrong. I just say this is what I see, and this is why I've appreciated being a part of this church as well, because it adheres to it. And this was already in place when I came here in 2005. It was already structured this way, and I really appreciated it. Let's move on for time's sake. Corporate board. This is where you have a board that is really leading the church, that is above the pastor. The board would designate, probably with congregational help, just some different forms there, who will be the pastor. So you have this corporate board model that sits above, directs the affairs of the church. What would be a challenge with this? There is an inherent challenge with this system here. What is it? It really depends how you define the church board, right? Who sits on the church board? What would be the inherent problem with who serves on the church board that would lead the church?
Well, they could have a nominating person that takes control
Sure.
of that
Yep.
board.
Could have a wayward board that would somewhat correct. Mm-hmm.
And they could feel, well, I don't really
Yeah.
care what the pastor says, but
Yeah.
We're the ones that are gonna
Right.
see what's going on here.
Well, in most cases, the church board isn't defined by elder qualifications. It's defined by what the church sees as an outcome of what they want to accomplish, as opposed to a biblically guided set of requirements. That's where I've seen this fail.
Or
It's like you
people
have
of
someone-
influence.
Yeah, you have someone who acts like a CEO because that's their background, and so they're not qualified necessarily as an elder, but they're qualified as a leader.
Yeah.
And then you have a treasurer, and that's who makes up the church board, but they're not pastors, they're not elders, and so.
Yeah, because if you replace this plurality of elders with a church board, you in effect have non-elders, a group of you're not looking at the biblical qualification of elders for who's leading your church and making the decisions anymore, correct? And Tim, you're gonna have people who are very gifted in leadership, perhaps mostly it's coming from, they're very talented and gifted in the secular world, coming over and applying those same skills. And there is some benefit to that piece, but more importantly, you don't have elders, you're no longer leading your church. And so that's a challenge for this model for sure. And then I'm gonna go to these last two. There's a congregational, my dad was a pastor of a congregational church for many years when I was growing up. And we voted on everything because that is the church votes. Now, I'm just gonna leave it at that. This is very popular in America because we uphold the democratic values so highly, and people, I wanna say, this is my church, I wanna say in how this is done. People want that, and I get that. The problem is, let's talk about what the inherent challenge for that is. There's a few we could probably speak of. What are they?
You get church splits. Is 51% agree on this, 49?
Yeah.
Let's make our own church.
Yeah. If majority rules, or what about the other 49% that's cried foul? Correct? What else?
This is where you need Robert's Rule of Order, because this is the only way to guarantee that not one group doesn't just control, and that can, to Troy's point, that can still happen, but at least that guarantees a structure for comment. But if you don't have that, then like whoever's the light loudest, whoever's the dominant personality is gonna rule.
Right. It could be chaos, yes, because remember, a pure democracy is the definition. There's no such thing as a pure democracy. It's chaos. You can't have a pure democracy. You can't have two people with opposing viewpoints both get what they want. It does not work that way. And so somewhere in this, it comes, there's some danger in this. The other danger is similar to the church board model. You're gonna have unbiblically qualified people making the decisions of the church. And that does not seem to be the New Testament model at all. And it also makes for really, really, really long meetings. I know from serving on a board of 8 to make decisions how long it takes to go through this, let alone with a congregation of a couple of hundred who are debating which should we go right or should we go left. It's challenging. And then I'm not sure about just let the Spirit lead. I tried to find some examples. That just seems... again, there's pros and cons to each one of these to wrap this up. I am very appreciative of the plurality of elder government. I know it's not perfect. We have our own challenges, but I do see that. And I have really appreciated being part of a church that is led by a plurality of elders. All right, we're going to move on. In the last 10 minutes, here's what I'm going to do let's discuss the women's role in church leader. Where do women stand in this? I'm going to go through this in about 10 minutes. I'm going to give a lot of some information here, and I encourage you to prayerfully go through this yourself and go back and study the scriptures. I'm going to preface this last part of our discussion, the chapter, with this. Always let the scriptures guide us in biblical truth, not culture. I don't care, pick any issue, because as soon as we let culture drive us, we no longer stand on biblical inerrancy. And I want to be careful, biblical inerrancy, if we hold to the doctrine that the scripture is truth, an absolute truth, God's truth that does not sway over time, then the truth as it was written through the prophets, the apostles, and given to us, it stands true. It's just as it did when it was first written. It has not changed. And I want to be careful because our culture, the Bible's under attack, and because it is not culturally relevant to a whole lot of people in this country and throughout the world, and it's been this way for a long time, certainly now more than ever. And so we have to be very careful with that. Is that we must go back to the source. So there's two issues with this. There's two places we can land. You can take a complementarian role on this issue, or you can take an egalitarian. I'll start with the bottom one. Egalitarian is where we get the word equal, that men and women are equal in all offices of the church, that there shouldn't be any difference, that they're all gifted by God, the spiritual gifts and leadership, that they should be able to serve as deacons, they should be able to serve as elders/pastors. There should be no difference at all. All are created equal. That is the prevailing cultural truth. I also want to say this too, one more caveat. We need to be sensitive and compassionate to this. I'm speaking and addressing a group of men in this room on this topic. And we need to be very careful how we approach this and not just brush off. There are women and men in our church, but I'm going to speak especially women in our church that are struggling with our complementarian position of Village Bible Church. And we need to recognize that and not just brush that off, but to have real meaningful dialogues and conversations with people. Perhaps you know a family member or your wife is struggling with this. I certainly respect that, and I know that our complementarian position is under attack and will be more and more. So I'm going to go into why we hold a complementarian position. Your best bet with this, because this is a big topic that we just don't have time to adequately address, is to go to, the link is here. You can read our church's position on this. I would start with that, which will go into much greater detail. Gruden's given a good defense. He sits on the Biblical Council of Manhood and Womanhood, has written a pretty exhaustive paper on the complementarian position. This is just a springboard for you to go and start digging into the scriptures. So I'm going to give a very broad overview. We won't even have a lot of time to discuss, but this is just a very difficult church and a difficult topic in the church today. It's difficult right now. We have women in our church struggling with this, so I think it's really important we recognize that and not just brush that off. All right, complementarian position is different. It says that men and women are equal in all things in creation in essence, but have different roles in the church. And I'm speaking just to the church now. We're not speaking about the home. That's a different topic for another time. For time's sake, we're talking about the context of leadership in the church, that men and women, to say it again, men and women are equal in all things, but they have different roles within the church. And that is the essence of the complementarian position. So let's go through this. I'm going to skip. This is a quote just saying that even among genuine Christians today, there's a lot of varying. If you ask the different commentator and pastors will write different papers on this, and even within the complementarian and egalitarian, they're going to write different nuances with this. But I want to keep I think this is a good way to at least start with these two definitions when it comes to what about women in the church? What does the Bible say about that? And so let's move on. First of all, Paul's teaching on equality. I think this is important. In 1 Corinthians 11, nevertheless in the Lord, woman is not independent of man, nor man of woman, for as woman was made from man, so man is now born of woman, and all things are from God. Galatians 3, there is neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, no male or female, for they are all one in Christ Jesus. I think it's really key when we look at our complementarian position that men and women are created equally in the sight of God. It is an issue of role, has nothing to do with anything else. That God has given different roles, capabilities to men and women. We are created differently in the eyes of God, yet there's a difference of role and responsibility within the church. It does not have anything to do with essence. I think that is really key when we try to understand what a complementarian position is. And the reality is, this doctrine has been abused by church leadership and men in the past in terrible, horrible ways. It just has. And I'll get ahead of myself again. Let's continue. Okay, let's see. So let's read a couple of verses here. 1 Corinthians 11:3 is what I always go back to define why I hold, and the church holds to a complementarian position. Because listen to this. Paul writes this, and remember, in 1 Corinthians, he's addressing disorder in the church. When he talks about the last chapters of we're going to go through this in detail soon in a few chapters in our book, but talks about the going through the spiritual gifts, and he's addressing disorder in the church over and over again when he writes the letter to the Corinthians. He says this, though, in 1 Corinthians 11, I want you to understand that the head of every man is Christ, the head of a wife is her husband, and the head of Christ is God. Look at that last statement. That's a profound statement. If we look at, without opening again our discussion on the Trinitarian view of who our God is, there is equality in the Trinity between the Godhead, correct? There is also clearly defined roles, submission, and responsibility one to another as, because to think about that statement, the head of Christ is God. If we, again, trying to understand and explain the Trinity, I can't do that because there's so much of it that does not make sense to my finite thinking. But if we look at that as our example, because we see that submission to the roles within the very Godhead itself. And I say that word submission because in some ways trepidation, because there's a mass negative quality assigned to that word, isn't it? When we think the word submit. So you think of a man as, or you're thinking of an American equality, I don't submit to anything. I'm my own person. I don't bow to anything. I'm my own we don't like that word. It was more common in the past, and it's going away when you look at the marriage vows. And again, I'm getting into the husband and the family a little bit, but I want to keep this on the church. That word that, when Paul, we're going to get into Ephesians, Paul says that wives should submit to their husband, and we're getting rid of that in marriage vows because that seems like a weakness, right? Wait a minute, that's wrong. I'm not submitting to anything. And yet, here we have as our model, to summarize this in 1 Corinthians 11, within the Trinity, we have equality with different recognized roles. And Jesus submitted to the will of his Father, even though he was equal, because that was the will of God. Not my will, but yours be done, and did that. So there's equality, and so I think that's our model. And then let's go to Luke 22. And he withdrew from them about a stone's throw, knelt down, Father, if you are willing, remove this cup from me. There it is. Nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done. And so we have that submission to, and we have that recognition of different roles with absolute equality. And I think there's good application for that when we look at our complementarian position. So why does this thought have such a negative consequence? Because we look at it from a human thinking and think that's a weakness. And I think I'm going to go back to the reality is that men have abused this leadership and used it for evil and wrong, I think, from the dawn of time. And certainly the church today have used it to suppress, to alienate, to be condescending, and that's wrong, and we're going to have to answer for that. And that's just a reality, too. So I'm going to keep moving, guys, just because we're going to be out of time. So then what then is, within the complementarian position, that our church would say this, that women can serve in every leadership, every role in the church except for elder and pastor. That's a complementarian. That is reserved, as we see in the scripture, again, not because of an inequality in who we are, but in essence of who we are as in defined roles, that has been given to the elders who should be men of the church. And so let's go ask the question, and then where does the scripture say women did serve in the church? And so here we see in Acts 18, I'll let you study this, Priscilla and Aquila spoke together to Apollos. They went together to speak the truth to Apollos. And so we see this, that there was teaching done together as the male and female team. They went together and did this because he only knew the baptism of John. They began to speak boldly. They spoke boldly in the synagogue. And they took him aside, explained to him the way of God more accurately. They took him aside and explained. So there was this a teaching aspect for Priscilla as well in this. And again, I think this is important. So right after I just read 1 Corinthians 11:3, here's the context. Paul did allow women to prophesy. He did. The women were prophesying in the New Testament church. Now, he had to address some chaos attached to it. So when he says this is in for every... But every wife who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head. Now, there's the issue of head coverings, but there's also the reality in the statement that they're prophesying. He's not saying they shouldn't prophesy. He's got an issue with the head coverings. So now we got to talk, we're not going to do this now. We're going to talk about what is prophesying in the New Testament church. That's coming. We're going to get there, so I'm not going to touch that now. And there's some thoughts on what that means. But here's the fact is, Paul's saying, yes, they're probably not having an issue with the prophesying, the standing up, they're speaking, they're doing this teaching aspect of prophesying in whatever context that was. But the issue is with the head coverings. Let's continue. And we see in Romans 16, Phoebe was a servant, and that's the same word used as deacon of the church. We use a verse such as this to why we have women serving in the office of deacon here at Village Bible Church, because it seems in the context of this, when Paul's writing, that Phoebe was a deacon and leader of the church, and so we have allowed that as well. We call them ministry directors here talked about that last week, but we do allow women to serve in every role and office of the church except for elder, and that includes deacon. And because of a verse like this, I commend you, our sister Phoebe, a servant of the church, welcome in the Lord, in a way worthy of the saints. Help her in whatever she may need from you. She has been a patron of many and of myself as well. Some would say, if you look at the qualifications for deacon, it seems to be male-oriented, correct? But then you read in verses like this and you think you can make a good argument that women did serve. Some would disagree with this and say she was not a deacon, and that the office of deacon, and elder should be only men in a complementarian position. That is not our position. Deacons can be women in Village Bible Church. So let's talk about some difficult passages, and they are difficult. And there's lots of people have interpreted these in different ways. The context for all three of these passages is that Paul was writing and maintaining order, and this is important, within the context of the church. I'm going to say it again. Within the context of the church, he is maintaining order where there was chaos. And again, there are others who have interpreted this different and may disagree with some of this. That's fine. This is where our complementarian position lands here at Village Bible Church. So let's look at these briefly first. 1 Timothy 2:11. I'm going to let you read that to yourself because Paul has seemingly some pretty harsh words here, correct? What does he mean by this? This applies to the assembled church, and I think you can make a good argument, Gruden does a good job with this, that it's talking about in this teaching and authoritative role, that he's talking about the context of being an elder, meaning that I don't permit a woman to teach or to exercise authority over a man. He's referring back to the qualifications for elder in a complementarian position. And he's also addressing, again, some disorder in the church, is that must have been, seemingly a group of women who were causing some issues and not behaving properly, and he addresses that. If you look at this verse 13, I didn't label them here, but he refers even back to the created order, that he's referring to his complementarian view, going back to even an order of creation. Some have taken this to even carried that, I think, too far, but he's even bringing in, this comes from he's saying my logic stems from even going back to creation. It's based even before the fall. So there's lots of people would take objections to this. Remember, they would say, but he's clearly talking about women were not educated at the time. They didn't have any opportunities. Clearly, this was just cultural. As other positions we have changed over time, we've come to be enlightened. This would be one of them, that clearly this was just for a cultural time that does not apply now, because people who would uphold an egalitarian position. And so again, within the context of the assembled church, referring back to the order in creation, and also really referring to the office of elder. And he's again saying that women should not serve in that office, but can in others. We are out of time. Let me finish with this, and then if anybody has questions, we're happy to tell you. If you want to chat later or email me, we'll do that. I'm just going to keep going. Let's go to the next difficult one, 1 Corinthians 14. A woman should keep silent in the churches. They're not permitted to speak. If there's anything they desire to learn, let them ask their husbands at home. And what this seemed, the context again, is there's chaos and disorder in the church caused by people not responding to the prophesying. We're going to have to talk about what that means. What was that? We'll do that later, but they're not responding well to that. And so Paul is again establishing order, because he did allow women to prophesy in the church. Let's not forget that. Women were prophesying in the church. He does not say they can't do that. What he says, there just can't be chaos surrounding it. And so that's the context for this passage. There's one more. This is, again, now we go back to verse 4. We read this in 4 and 5, is that this is referring to the issue with the head covering, not that they can't prophesy. It's referring to the issue of head covering. So that was an issue in the church. Somehow the wearing of the head coverings was causing chaos. He's addressing this and says, if in that context, you could argue the head covering is cultural, but the prophesying, he is not negating that, because he never says that they can't prophesy. He makes a statement that they were, and does not say that they can't. So there's 3 difficult passages. You need to go back, if that's an interest of you, for more clarity, to spend some time reading through those carefully. I would do that. There's just time's not going to permit us to really dig deep into this. This is why we hold to a complementarian position here at Village Bible Church. And I'm going to wrap up with this for conclusions. 1, this whole doctrine of church government, so let's just talk as a whole, not just women, is not a core doctrine. There's a lot of leeway within. There's some truths that we need to set up elders. There's qualifications for elders. We need to be careful that even though I hold to this plurality model, I do view that as closest to the most pure in Gruden's terms. I'm not going to look back and say the others got it all wrong. I just think this is the most pure for us. Second, scriptures, not culture, must dictate all truth for us, including this complementarian versus egalitarian position. We must go back to our source. What do the scriptures teach us on this? And last, guys, I'll say this too. We as men in the church need to approach this with humility and compassion, because this is a struggle for some. We need to recognize that and pray for the ladies in the church and uphold them as all equal with us. And we need to make sure, if you look at, let's just take the husband and wife model. We're going to get to this in Ephesians 5. We are commanded to love our wives. How? There's our example. And how did Christ love us as his church? Sacrificial to the point of death. That is the love. That's the leadership we have to show. And I think that model for us as elders too, is that, and we have to show that John 13 leadership of the church. That's putting a towel on and washing feet. And so that's that servant leadership with all humility. That is how we are called to lead. That's how we are called to love our wives. That's the type of love. And say that is not authoritarian. That is not making demands. That is not condescending in any way. That is a totally different type of leadership. That has to be the type of leadership that we model here at the church. There are different roles we see in the scriptures for men and women. There are. It does not have anything to do with lack of equality between men and women at all. And if we've made it that, then we are wrong, and we're going to have to answer for it. So, any final thoughts? I did go 10 minutes over. Final thoughts on this heavy topic in a short amount of time. I'm going to close this in prayer. Lord, I thank you again for the teaching of your word. Lord, I just pray you would help us to approach these difficult topics by going back again to your truth, and give us humility, Lord. Teach us, open our eyes. May we study well and speak to us through your Spirit. God, you promised to do that. Lord, thank you that we can trust in your word. It endures, it's inerrant, it's complete. God, thank you so much for revealing that to us, and that we have it in our hands and that we can study. Lord, I ask that as we go to continue studying these topics, Lord, that you would bless it this week. Bless all the guys in this room as we go now and do all that we do throughout the week. Lord, may we keep our eyes always on you. In Christ's name, amen. All right. Thanks, guys. Next week, chapter 48, means of grace within the church. So the questions we're going to be looking at, what are the different activities within the life of the church that God uses to bring blessing to us? If you come from a Catholic background, the answer to that is going to be very different than what we would hold to. And last, what do we miss when we neglect being involved in the church? Have a great week, guys.